The knock on the shop door came so hard that the glass rattled in its frame. Elena Marsh froze behind the counter, her hand still holding a small brown bottle of lavender oil. It was well past midnight. No customer came at this hour, not in this quiet corner of the city, not since the lamps along the street had been put out for the night. She set the bottle down slowly and listened. The knock came again, heavier this time, as if a fist wrapped in leather was striking the wood. Her son Oliver was asleep upstairs, and every instinct in her body told her to stay silent, to let whoever it was believe the shop was empty. But then a voice called through the door, low and commanding, a voice that did not belong to a beggar or a drunk stumbling home from a tavern. "Open this door. I know you are awake. I saw the candle." Elena's heart pounded. She recognized authority in that voice, the kind that expected to be obeyed without question. She crossed the room carefully, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and peered through the narrow gap in the curtain. A tall figure stood on her doorstep, wrapped in a dark coat, his face half hidden by shadow and the brim of his hat. Behind him, a black carriage waited at the curb, its lanterns glowing like watchful eyes, its horses stamping impatiently on the cobblestones. She knew that carriage. Everyone in the city knew it. It belonged to Duke Damien Ashworth, the man they called the coldest heart in the kingdom, the man whose own household staff were said to fear the sound of his footsteps. Rumors followed him everywhere, whispered in ballrooms and market stalls alike. Some said his first wife had died because he willed it. Others said he had buried 3 rivals in business dealings that left them ruined and broken. No one dared cross him, and no one, especially not a widow living alone with a young son, wanted him standing at their door in the middle of the night. Elena's hand trembled as she reached for the latch. She thought of running, of waking Oliver and slipping out the back, but something told her that a man like this would not be stopped by a locked door. Better to face him and understand what he wanted than to hide and wonder. She opened the door only enough to look at him properly. Up close, he was younger than she expected, though his eyes carried a weariness that made him seem older than his years. His jaw was sharp, his expression unreadable, and there was something in the way he held himself, straight and controlled, that suggested a man used to carrying enormous weight without ever setting it down. "Your Grace," she said carefully, using the title because she did not know what else to call him. "It is very late. My son is asleep." "I am aware of the hour," he said. "I would not have come if the matter could wait until morning. May I come in?" Elena hesitated. Every rule of propriety told her to refuse a man into her home at this hour, especially a man alone with her, a widow with no husband to stand beside her. But there was something in his voice, some thread of desperation beneath the command, that made her step back and let him pass. He entered the small shop and looked around at the shelves of dried herbs, the neat rows of glass jars, the faint smell of chamomile and mint hanging in the air. He seemed out of place among such simple things, a man built for marble halls standing instead in a room meant for healing coughs and easing headaches. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," he said, turning to face her. "I have come to ask something of you, and I am prepared to pay generously for your answer, whatever it may be." Elena folded her arms, steadying herself. What could a duke possibly want from an apothecary's widow? "A wife," he said simply, "or rather the appearance of one." For a moment Elena thought she had misheard him. She almost laughed, but the seriousness in his face stopped her. "My grandmother is dying," he continued before she could respond. "She has one wish left in this world, and that is to see me married before she passes. She has given me until the end of the month. If I fail to produce a wife by then, everything I have built, everything my family has held for generations, passes to my cousin Reginald." "And why does that concern me?" "Because Reginald is not a man who should ever hold power over an estate, or over the people who depend on it," Damien said, his voice hardening. "He has already begun making arrangements as though the inheritance were his. Servants who have worked for my family for 30 years would be turned out within a week of his taking control. Tenants who rely on fair treatment would find themselves at the mercy of a man with no patience for mercy at all. Alina studied him, trying to see through the calm mask he wore. Surely there are women of your own class who would leap at the chance to become your duchess. Why come to me? Because a woman of my own class would want more than a marriage of convenience. She would want the title in truth, the position, the permanence. I need someone who understands this is temporary. Someone who has no interest in staying bound to me forever, and no interest in the scandal that would follow the truth being known, should it ever come to light. And what happens after your grandmother passes, after the inheritance is secured? We separate quietly. You return to your life, considerably wealthier than you are now, with enough to secure your son's future for years to come. I return to mine. Alina's mind raced. She thought of the debts piling up since her husband's death, the roof that leaked when it rained, the school fees she could not afford for Oliver, the fear that kept her awake most nights, wondering how she would manage another winter. And yet she also thought of the rumors, the stories whispered about this man and the wife who had died in his house under circumstances no one ever fully explained. They say things about you, she said quietly, terrible things. They say many things, he replied, without flinching. Most of them false, some of them exaggerated. I will not insult you by pretending I am without flaws, but I have never harmed a soul who did not first try to harm what belongs to me. It was not quite a denial, and Alina noticed that. But there was something steady in the way he met her eyes, something that did not waver even under her suspicion. I need an answer tonight, he said. The wedding must take place within the week if it is to satisfy the terms of my grandmother's will. A week, Alina repeated, stunned. You want me to marry a stranger within a week? I understand the request is enormous. That is why the payment will be enormous as well. Enough to open a proper shop in a better part of the city. Enough to send your son to any school you choose. Enough that you would never again lie awake wondering how you will pay for bread. Alina turned away from him, walking toward the small window that looked out onto the dark street. She thought of Oliver upstairs, curled up under a thin blanket that was becoming too small for him. She thought of the winter ahead, the coal she could not afford, the fear that had become so familiar it no longer even felt like fear anymore, just a constant weight she carried everywhere. If I agree, she said slowly, I want it in writing. Every promise you have made tonight in writing, signed before witnesses I trust. Of course. And you will not touch me, not in any way that a true marriage would require. This is business, nothing more. I would expect nothing less of the arrangement, he said, and for the first time, something flickered across his face that might have been respect. And my son will be safe. Whatever happens between us, whatever comes from your cousin or anyone else, Oliver will not be harmed. I will guard him as I would guard my own blood, Damien said, and this time his voice carried a weight that made Alina believe him, despite everything she had heard. She turned back to face him, her heart still pounding, though now for entirely different reasons than fear alone. Then I accept, under the conditions I have named. Damien nodded once, as though a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders, though his expression remained composed. A carriage will come for you and your son tomorrow evening. We will be married 3 days after that, in a small ceremony at the manor chapel. My staff will prepare everything you need. And what do I tell people? What do I tell Oliver? Tell him the truth as much as you are able, that his mother has married a duke and that his life is about to change. The rest, the reasons behind it, need not concern a child. After he left, Alina stood alone in the shop for a long while, staring at the door he had closed so quietly behind him. The candle had burned low, and shadows stretched long across the floor. She thought of the man's eyes, the strange mixture of control and desperation she had seen in them, and she wondered, not for the first time that night, whether she had just agreed to save her son's future, or whether she had agreed to walk directly into danger, she did not yet understand. Upstairs, Oliver stirred in his sleep, murmuring something she could not make out. Alina climbed the stairs slowly and sat beside his bed, watching him breathe, memorizing the small, ordinary comfort of this moment before everything changed. Tomorrow, she would tell him they were leaving this shop, this street, this life they had built out of nothing after his father died. Tomorrow, she would begin pretending to be a duchess. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she packed what little they owned into 2 worn trunks, folding Oliver's clothes carefully, wrapping her husband's old pocket watch in a handkerchief, the one possession she could not bear to leave behind. She thought of her husband, gone 3 years now, and wondered what he would think of the choice she was making. She decided, somewhere near dawn, that he would understand. He had always wanted better for their son than the life a small apothecary shop could offer. The carriage arrived precisely at the hour Damien had promised. Alina stood in the doorway of the shop she had run for 3 years, the only home Oliver had ever truly known, and felt the strange grief of leaving something behind even as she stepped toward something greater. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a scar across one eyebrow, helped load their trunks without a word, though he glanced at her with something like sympathy, as though he understood exactly what kind of arrangement had brought a widow and her son to this carriage. The journey to Ashworth Manor took nearly 2 hours, winding through countryside that grew grander and more manicured the further they traveled from the city. Oliver pressed his face against the window the entire way, wide-eyed at the size of the estates they passed, the iron gates, the endless green fields dotted with grazing sheep. Alina watched him with a tight feeling in her chest, torn between hope for the life this could give him and fear of what she had agreed to. When the manor itself came into view, Alina understood for the first time the true scale of what she had married into. The building rose from the landscape like something out of an old story, gray stone walls, stretching wider than any building she had ever seen, dozens of windows catching the afternoon light, a fountain in the courtyard where water spilled endlessly over carved stone figures. Oliver gasped audibly, and even Alina, who had told herself she would remain composed no matter what she saw, felt her breath catch in her throat. A woman was waiting on the front steps as the carriage pulled to a stop, dressed in dark, practical clothing, her gray hair pulled back severely from a face that seemed permanently set in disapproval. This, Alina would soon learn, was Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper who had run the manor for over 20 years and who regarded any newcomer, especially a widow marrying the Duke under circumstances she clearly found suspicious, with open wariness. "You must be the new mistress," Mrs. Whitfield said, her tone giving away nothing of what she truly thought. "His Grace asked me to see you settled before dinner. This way, please." Alina took Oliver's hand and followed the housekeeper into the manor, the enormous front doors closing behind them with a heavy, final sound. The entrance hall alone was larger than her entire shop had been, with a ceiling painted in faded scenes of clouds and angels, a staircase that curved upward in 2 long arms, and portraits lining the walls, generations of Ashworth staring down with the same sharp, unreadable expression she had seen in Damien's eyes the night before. As they climbed the stairs, Alina caught sight of a portrait near the top, larger than the others, of a woman with pale hair and delicate features, her expression somehow both beautiful and deeply sad. She paused, and Mrs. Whitfield followed her gaze without being asked. "That is the late Duchess," the housekeeper said, her voice carefully flat. "His Grace's first wife. She died in this house 3 years ago." Alina felt a chill move through her, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun pouring through the windows. What happened to her? Mrs. Whitfield's expression tightened, and for a moment Alina thought she would refuse to answer. "That is not my story to tell," she said finally. "You would do well to ask His Grace himself if you dare. Now, come. Your rooms are this way, and dinner will be served promptly at 7. His Grace does not tolerate lateness." They continued down a long corridor, Oliver's small footsteps echoing against the polished floor, and Alina found herself glancing back once more at the portrait of the woman with pale hair, wondering what secrets waited for her inside these grand, silent walls, and whether she had truly understood what kind of bargain she had made the night before, standing in the candlelight of her own small shop, believing she was simply trading her freedom for her son's future. Now, walking deeper into the heart of Ashworth Manor, she began to suspect the price might be far greater than money alone. Dinner that evening was a quiet, formal affair. Damien sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 30 guests, though only 3 places had been set, one for himself, one for Alina, and a smaller one for Oliver, who sat wide-eyed and silent, overwhelmed by the size of the room and the row of servants standing along the wall. Damien spoke little, offering only brief instructions to the staff and the occasional question directed at Oliver about his interests, his schooling, whether he preferred dogs or horses. Alina watched him carefully throughout the meal, searching for some sign of the cruelty the rumors described, but found instead a man who seemed almost painfully controlled, as though he feared what might happen if he allowed himself to relax even slightly. After dinner, as a maid led Oliver up to bed, Damien asked Alina to remain in the drawing room a moment longer. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the fine furniture and the tall windows that overlooked the darkening gardens. "The wedding will take place in 3 days," he said, standing near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. "My grandmother wishes to attend, though her health makes travel difficult. We will hold the ceremony here, in the chapel on the eastern grounds." "And after that," Alina asked, "what is expected of me exactly?" "You will be seen as my wife in every public setting. You will attend events at my side, greet guests, manage the household as any duchess would. In private, you may live as you please within reason. I will not interfere with your habits, and I ask that you extend me the same courtesy." "There is a portrait of your first wife on the staircase," Alina said carefully, watching his face for any reaction. "Mrs. Whitfield would not tell me how she died." Something shifted behind Damien's eyes, a flicker of pain quickly suppressed. "That is not a subject I discuss," he said, his voice suddenly cold in a way it had not been before. "I would ask that you do not raise it again, not with me and not with the staff. I only wish to understand the household I am entering." "You are entering an arrangement, Mrs. Marsh, not a household you need to understand beyond its surface. Ask me about the estate, the tenants, the responsibilities you will hold as my wife in public. Do not ask me about Cassandra." The name hung in the air between them, the first time he had spoken it aloud, and Alina understood, even without further explanation, that whatever had happened to the late Duchess had left a wound in this man that had never properly healed. She said nothing more on the subject that night, though the question remained lodged in her mind like a splinter she could not remove. As she climbed the stairs to her new bedroom later that evening, she passed the portrait of Cassandra once more, and this time she studied it longer, searching the painted face for some clue, some answer to the mystery that had already begun to unsettle her new home. The pale eyes seemed to follow her as she walked past, and Alina could not shake the feeling that she had walked into a story that had never truly ended, only paused, waiting for someone new to arrive and stir it back to life. Behind a closed door somewhere in the eastern wing of the manor, unseen by Alina, a man watched the carriage that had brought her from a window overlooking the courtyard, his expression twisted with something between contempt and calculation. Reginald Ashworth had heard the news of his cousin's sudden marriage with disbelief, then fury, and now, standing alone in the shadowed hallway outside his own borrowed rooms, he began to consider exactly what he might do about a widow who threatened to take away everything he had spent years quietly arranging to claim for himself. He did not yet know her name, only that she was a nobody plucked from some forgotten corner of the city, a woman with no family, no connections, no power to protect herself should things become difficult. That, he decided as he turned away from the window, might prove to be exactly the weakness he needed. The wedding took place on a gray morning, with mist still clinging to the grass of the eastern grounds when Alina walked the short path to the chapel. She wore a simple gown of pale blue, nothing like the elaborate gowns she imagined a real duchess might wear, and she was grateful for that small mercy, since an elaborate gown would have felt like a lie stitched into every seam. Damien waited at the chapel door, dressed in dark gray, his face composed into the same unreadable calm she had come to expect from him. An elderly woman sat in the front pew, wrapped in blankets despite the mild weather, her eyes bright and watchful beneath a lace cap. This was Lady Beatrice, Damien's grandmother, the woman whose dying wish had set this entire arrangement into motion. The ceremony itself was brief, the words exchanged quickly and quietly, and Alina found herself surprised by how steady her own voice remained as she spoke the vows that were meant to bind her to a stranger. When it was finished, Lady Beatrice reached out a thin, trembling hand and grasped Alina's fingers with surprising strength. "You have kind eyes," the old woman said, studying her closely. "I hope my grandson has the sense to see that." "Grandmother," Damien said, a note of warning in his voice. "Hush," Lady Beatrice replied, waving him off without looking away from Alina. "I have waited 3 years to see you married again, Damien. Do not scold me now for enjoying the moment." Alina caught something in the old woman's words, a weight behind the phrase "married again," and wondered exactly how much Lady Beatrice knew about the true nature of this arrangement, whether she believed it was real, or whether she, too, understood it was simply a performance meant to satisfy the terms of a will. In the days that followed, Alina began to learn the rhythms of her new life. Mrs. Whitfield remained cool and distant, offering instructions in a clipped tone that made clear she considered Alina an intruder rather than a mistress. The younger maids whispered when they thought she could not hear, comparing her plain manners to the elegance of the late Duchess, wondering aloud how long this new arrangement would last before it collapsed like so many other rumors surrounding the Ashworth family. Damien gave her few rules, but he delivered them with the seriousness of a man laying down laws that could not be broken. She was never to ask about his past beyond what he chose to share. She was never to enter the locked rooms of the West Wing, which he explained had been closed since Cassandra's death and remained untouched out of respect, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the silence than simple grief. And she was never to trust anyone within the manor completely, not the staff, not his associates, and especially not his cousin Reginald, who had taken up residence in a guest wing while he waited, Alina suspected, for the marriage to fail. Reginald made his first appearance at breakfast 3 days after the wedding, sliding into a chair across from Alina with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated way, his clothes finely tailored, his manner smooth in the way of men accustomed to charming their way past suspicion. "So this is the woman who saved my cousin's inheritance," he said, studying Alina the way a merchant might study a piece of furniture he intended to buy cheaply and sell for profit. "Tell me, Mrs. Marsh, how does an apothecary's widow find herself suddenly elevated to duchess? Quite the fortunate turn of events, wouldn't you say?" "I would say, Damien, and I found an arrangement that suited us both," Alina replied evenly, refusing to let him see how his words unsettled her. "An arrangement," Reginald repeated, savoring the word. "How diplomatic. I do wonder, though, what happens to such arrangements once the terms have been satisfied. Marriages built on convenience have a way of dissolving just as conveniently, don't they?" "Reginald," Damien said, entering the room at that moment, his voice carrying the same cold edge Alina had heard the night he first came to her shop. "You will speak to my wife with respect, or you will take your meals elsewhere." Reginald raised his hands in mock surrender, still smiling. "Of course, cousin, I meant no offense. I only wished to understand my new family member better." After Reginald left the room, Damien sat across from Alina, his jaw tight with something between anger and worry. "Do not let him near your son," he said quietly. "Whatever else you take from what I tell you, take that. You think he would harm Oliver? I think Reginald has spent years believing this inheritance belongs to him. He has convinced himself of it so thoroughly that he no longer sees the difference between what is his by right and what he simply wants badly enough to take. A man like that becomes dangerous when the thing he wants is threatened." Alina studied her husband's face, searching for the source of such certainty. "You speak as though you know this from experience." Damien's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "I know it because I have watched him circle this family for years, waiting for weakness. Do not underestimate him simply because he smiles." Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, Alina found herself watching Damien just as closely as she watched Reginald in the days that followed, trying to understand the true nature of a man the entire kingdom seemed to fear. What she found did not match the rumors. She saw him rise before dawn to review the accounts of tenant farms, ensuring families struggling after a poor harvest received extensions on their rent rather than eviction notices. She saw him kneel, without any audience to witness it, to help a young stable boy who had fallen and scraped his knee, speaking to the child with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with his reputation. She saw him correct a footman who had spoken sharply to one of the younger maids, not with cruelty, but with a firm insistence that his household treat every person within it with basic decency. And yet, alongside these small kindnesses, she also saw the walls he kept around himself, walls built so high and so carefully that even after weeks of living under the same roof, she felt she knew almost nothing true about him. He rarely spoke of his childhood. He never mentioned his parents, both long deceased, except in passing references to their expectations of him. And whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near the subject of Cassandra, he found a reason to leave the room entirely. One evening, unable to sleep, Alina wandered the halls of the manor and found herself standing before the locked door of the west wing, the one place Damien had forbidden her to enter. She pressed her palm against the cool wood, wondering what secrets waited behind it, wondering whether the answer to Cassandra's death lay hidden in whatever room Damien had chosen to seal away rather than face. "You should not be here." Alina turned quickly to find Damien standing at the end of the corridor, dressed in a loose shirt, his hair disheveled as though he, too, had been unable to sleep. He crossed the distance between them slowly, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "I could not sleep," Alina said honestly. "I found myself walking and my feet brought me here. This door remains locked for a reason." "What happened to her, Damien?" The question left her lips before she could stop it, softer than she intended, carrying none of the accusation Mrs. Whitfield or the whispering maids might have used. "You do not have to tell me everything, but I am living in this house now, raising my son under this roof. I deserve to understand what I might be walking into." For a long moment, Damien said nothing, his eyes fixed on the locked door as though he could see straight through the wood to whatever lay beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Alina had ever heard it. "She fell," he said, "from the balcony above the garden. That is what the physician ruled and that is what the magistrate accepted. An accident, nothing more." "But you do not believe that." "I do not know what I believe," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised her more than any confession of guilt would have. "I know that she was unhappy in our marriage, that our union had been arranged by our families with no regard for whether we suited each other at all. I know that Reginald visited the manor often during that final year, always with some excuse, always finding reasons to speak with her alone. And I know that the night she died, I was away from the manor on business, and by the time I returned, she was already gone." Alina felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "You think Reginald had something to do with it?" "I have no proof. I have only suspicion, and a magistrate who was quite easily satisfied with a simple explanation for a woman who had never once shown any fear of heights or any carelessness near that balcony in the 3 years I knew her." Damien ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time, Alina saw exhaustion in his face, the weight of 3 years spent carrying a doubt he could never quite prove nor quite release. I closed this wing because I could not bear to walk past her rooms every day, wondering. I am not asking you to solve a mystery I have failed to solve myself. I am only asking you to understand why I guard what remains of my family so carefully, and why I fear for you and your son more than you might realize. Something shifted in Alina that night, standing in the quiet corridor with a man the entire kingdom believed to be without a heart. She saw, for the first time, the true shape of his loneliness, the years he had spent suspecting a truth he could not prove, surrounded by a household that whispered about him rather than comforting him, carrying a grief that had no proper outlet because it was tangled together with suspicion and doubt. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I will not raise it again unless you wish to speak of it." Damien nodded, and for a brief moment something like gratitude passed across his features before the familiar composure settled back into place. "It grows late," he said. "You should return to your rooms before the household wakes and finds us standing here." As Alina walked away, she glanced back once and found him still standing before the locked door, his hand resting against the wood exactly where hers had been moments before, as though he, too, could not quite let go of whatever waited on the other side. In the weeks that followed, something between them began to shift in small, quiet ways. Damien began seeking her out at breakfast even when his schedule allowed him to eat alone. He asked after Oliver's lessons, arranged for a tutor skilled in mathematics after learning the boy showed a talent for numbers, and once, without any explanation, left a small wooden horse carved with careful detail on Oliver's bed, a gift Alina suspected came from Damien's own boyhood, kept and treasured through all the cold years that followed. Alina found herself, despite every warning she had given herself the night she agreed to this arrangement, beginning to look forward to these small moments, these glimpses of the man beneath the reputation. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply growing accustomed to her new circumstances, that the flutter she felt when Damien's eyes met hers across the breakfast table was nothing more than the strange nervousness of a stranger's household. But late at night, lying awake in the grand bedroom that still felt too large and too silent, she found herself wondering what it might mean to want something real from a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a bargain struck in candlelight. Meanwhile, in the shadowed corners of the manor, Reginald continued his careful observations, noting every small change between his cousin and the widow with growing unease. He had expected the marriage to remain distant, transactional, easily dissolved once his grandmother's condition resolved one way or another. He had not expected to see Damien smile, actually smile, at something the widow's son said during dinner one evening, a sight so unfamiliar that Reginald found himself unsettled by it in ways he did not fully understand. If this arrangement hardened into something real, something that could not simply be dissolved with quiet paperwork once Lady Beatrice passed, then Reginald's plans would need to change as well. He began spending more time in the city, meeting quietly with men whose discretion could be purchased, gathering whatever information and leverage he could find, preparing himself for whatever measures might become necessary to reclaim what he still believed, with growing bitterness, belonged to him and him alone. The first grand event Alina attended as Damien's wife was a gathering held at the home of Lord Whitmore, one of the few families in the region who had maintained cordial relations with the Ashworth household, despite the shadows that clung to their name. Alina stood at Damien's side in a gown of deep green, her hair arranged by a maid who had finally warmed slightly toward her after weeks of careful patience, and felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes upon her the moment they entered the ballroom. "They are all wondering the same thing," Damien murmured close to her ear as they moved through the crowd, greeting guests with practiced smiles. "Whether the apothecary's widow will embarrass herself, or whether she has somehow tamed the coldest duke in the kingdom. And which do you think they will decide?" "I think," he said, and something in his tone carried an unfamiliar warmth, "that they will be surprised by how well you hold your own." Throughout the evening, Alina watched Damien navigate conversations with the careful precision of a man accustomed to being watched and judged at every turn. He introduced her not as an afterthought, but with genuine pride in his voice, correcting anyone who addressed her too casually, standing close enough that his presence alone silenced the cruelest of whispers before they could fully form. When an older woman remarked, not quite quietly enough, that it was a curious thing for a duke to marry so far beneath his station, Damien responded before Alina could even open her mouth. "My wife runs a household with more competence than most women born to it," he said evenly. "I would remind you that character is not inherited through blood alone, Lady Catherine, though I understand the distinction may be unfamiliar to some." The older woman flushed and excused herself quickly, and Alina felt a surge of something unexpected, gratitude mixed with a warmth she had not anticipated feeling for a man she had married as nothing more than a temporary arrangement. Later that evening, during a rare quiet moment on the balcony overlooking Lord Whitmore's gardens, Damien stood beside her in silence for a long while before speaking. "You handled tonight better than I expected," he said. "You expected me to fail. I expected you to struggle, as anyone unfamiliar with these circles might. I did not expect you to silence Lady Catherine's daughter with nothing more than a well-placed comment about the price of imported silk versus locally woven wool. I believe you have made an enemy for life, and I believe you have earned my genuine respect in the process." Alina laughed, a real laugh, surprising herself with how easily it came. "I did not realize dukes were capable of such compliments. I did not realize widows were capable of disarming an entire ballroom with nothing but sharp wit and a steady voice," he replied. And when their eyes met, something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged aloud, though Alina felt it settle deep in her chest, warm and unfamiliar and slightly frightening in its intensity. As the weeks turned into months, these small moments accumulated between them like coins dropped one at a time into a growing collection. Damien began seeking her opinion on estate matters he once would have handled entirely alone. He asked her thoughts on a proposal to expand the tenant school, listened carefully as she suggested practical improvements drawn from her own experience running a small business, and implemented changes based on her advice, without ever making her feel as though her input was merely tolerated rather than genuinely valued. Alina, in turn, found herself confiding in him in ways she had not confided in anyone since her husband's death. She told him about the fear that had gripped her every night after her husband passed, wondering how she would keep Oliver fed and clothed, the shame she felt asking neighbors for small loans she could not always repay quickly, the loneliness of raising a child alone in a world that offered widows very little sympathy and even less practical support. "I understand loneliness better than you might think," Damien admitted one evening as they sat together in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth while Oliver slept soundly upstairs. "My marriage to Cassandra was arranged before either of us had any say in the matter. We were strangers who shared a house, a name, and very little else. I spent 3 years believing that was simply what marriage meant, a polite arrangement between two people who tolerated each other's presence for the sake of appearances. And now I find myself wondering if I ever understood what marriage could truly be," he said quietly, not quite looking at her. "I find myself, against every intention I held when I first came to your shop, hoping that what we have built here does not end simply because a will has been satisfied." Alina's breath caught in her throat. She had felt the same shift within herself for weeks now, had lain awake many nights wondering whether the warmth she felt toward this man was simply gratitude for her rescued circumstances, or something deeper and far more dangerous to a heart she had promised herself she would guard carefully after her husband's death. Hearing him voice the same uncertainty aloud, in the flickering firelight of a room that had slowly become as familiar to her as any place she had ever called home, undid something in her that she had held tightly closed for a very long time. "I find myself hopping the same thing," she admitted softly. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that evening, both too cautious, too uncertain of what such a step might mean. But something had shifted permanently between them, an acknowledgement neither could take back, a foundation upon which something far more real than their original bargain had begun quietly to grow. It was only 2 weeks later that the incident occurred which changed everything. Alina had gone walking alone through the eastern gardens in the early evening, a habit she had developed to clear her mind after long days managing household affairs and overseeing Oliver's lessons. The path wound near the edge of a small ravine, bordered by an old stone wall that had stood for generations, worn smooth by decades of weather, but still considered sturdy enough for anyone to lean against safely while admiring the view of the valley below. She had barely rested her hand against the stone when a section of the wall gave way beneath her, crumbling suddenly and without warning, sending loose rock tumbling down into the ravine below. Alina stumbled backward just in time, her heart slamming against her ribs as she watched several feet of what had appeared to be solid stone collapse into the depths, a fall that would have easily proven fatal had she been standing even slightly closer, or had her reflexes been even a moment slower. Shaken and covered in dust, she made her way back to the manor as quickly as her trembling legs would carry her, finding Damien in his study reviewing papers by lamplight. The moment he saw her face, pale and streaked with dirt, he was on his feet instantly, crossing the room to grasp her shoulders with a gentleness that contradicted the alarm evident in his eyes. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "The garden wall," she managed, still catching her breath. "It simply gave way beneath me. I nearly fell into the ravine." Damien's expression shifted from concern to something colder, harder, a controlled fury that Alina had never witnessed in him before. "That wall has stood without incident for over 60 years, he said, his voice deceptively quiet. "Show me." He accompanied her back to the site immediately, examining the collapsed section of stone with the careful attention of a man searching for evidence rather than simply assessing an accident. What he found there made his jaw tighten with barely restrained anger. "This was not weather damage," he said, crouching to examine the broken edges of the fallen stones. "Look here, where the mortar has been chipped away deliberately, recently, not worn down gradually over years. Someone weakened this section intentionally." Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "You believe someone did this to me deliberately?" "I believe," Damien said, standing and turning to face her, his expression grim, "that someone within this household or with access to these grounds wanted you gone, and wanted it to appear as nothing more than an unfortunate accident." That night, after Oliver had been settled safely to bed under the watch of a maid Damien trusted completely, Damien summoned every senior member of his household staff to the drawing room, questioning each of them individually about their movements over the past several days, about who had access to the gardens, about whether anyone had noticed workers or strangers near the eastern wall. No clear answers emerged, though Alina noticed that Reginald had conveniently absented himself from the manor for the entire week, claiming urgent business in the city that no one could quite verify. "You believe it was him," Alina said quietly. Once the staff had been dismissed and they sat alone together in the drawing room, the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. "I believe he has motive, and I believe he has grown desperate enough in recent weeks to consider measures he would not have contemplated when this arrangement first began," Damien said, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "I should never have brought you into this danger. I convinced myself this arrangement would remain simple, contained, a matter of paperwork and appearances only. I did not anticipate that my cousin's greed would extend to threatening your life." "You could not have known," Alina said, though she understood the guilt weighing on him, The same guilt she suspected had followed him since Cassandra's death. The terrible burden of wondering whether he might have prevented tragedy had he only paid closer attention, acted sooner, trusted his instincts rather than dismissing his suspicions as unfounded paranoia. "I cannot lose you," Damien said suddenly, the words escaping him with a rawness that surprised them both. "I told myself this arrangement was temporary, that I would remain guarded, that I would not allow myself to feel anything beyond simple gratitude for your assistance. I have failed entirely at maintaining that distance, and now, faced with the possibility that I nearly lost you tonight, I find I cannot pretend otherwise any longer." Alina reached across the small space between them, taking his hand in hers, feeling the tension in his fingers slowly ease beneath her touch. "You have not lost me," she said softly. "I am here, and I do not intend to be so easily removed from this house or from your life." "Reginald will not stop simply because this attempt failed," Damien said, though something in his voice had softened, steadied by her nearness. "If anything, failure will make him more careful next time, more determined to find a method that cannot be traced back to him." "Then we will be more careful as well," Alina said, with a resolve that surprised even herself. "I did not survive losing my husband and rebuilding a life for my son simply to be frightened away by a man who believes greed entitles him to whatever he wants. Whatever comes next, we will face it together." Damien studied her for a long moment in the dim firelight, something shifting behind his eyes that looked remarkably like hope, an emotion Alina suspected he had rarely allowed himself to feel in the years since his first marriage had ended in tragedy and suspicion. "Together," he repeated quietly, as though testing the weight of the word, finding it steadier and more welcome than he had expected. From that night forward, Damien assigned additional guards to watch over both Alina and Oliver, insisting that neither of them walk the grounds unaccompanied, that every meal be prepared under careful supervision, that any unfamiliar face within the manor be reported immediately. Alina found the precautions unsettling at first, a constant reminder of the danger surrounding her, but she also found comfort in Damien's fierce determination to protect what he had clearly come to consider genuinely his own, not merely an arrangement to be managed, but a family worth defending with everything he possessed. Reginald returned from his supposed business in the city 3 days later, offering polite condolences upon hearing of the garden wall's collapse and Alina's narrow escape, his expression carefully arranged into concern that did not quite reach his eyes. Alina studied him carefully throughout dinner that evening, searching for any crack in his composed performance, any flicker of guilt or satisfaction that might confirm Damien's suspicions. She found nothing definitive, only the same smooth charm Reginald always presented, though she noticed Damien watching his cousin with an intensity that suggested he, too, was searching for the same cracks, waiting for the moment when Reginald's careful mask might finally slip, revealing the truth that lay hidden beneath. As the weeks continued, Alina and Damien grew closer still, drawn together by shared danger as much as by the genuine affection that had slowly blossomed between them since that first frightened night in her small shop. What had begun as a desperate bargain between two strangers had transformed, gradually and then all at once, into something neither of them had expected nor dared to hope for, a partnership built not merely on convenience, but on trust, respect, and a growing love that neither could deny, even as the shadow of Reginald's ambition continued to hang over their household, waiting patiently for its next opportunity to strike. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not to Ashworth Manor, but to the desk of every prominent household within the city, an anonymous accusation claiming that the Duke of Ashworth had purchased a false marriage, paying a poor widow to pose as his wife in order to secure an inheritance through deception rather than genuine union. By afternoon, the story had spread through every drawing room and social gathering, whispered behind fans and exchanged in knowing glances at the market square, until it reached Lady Beatrice herself, who summoned both Damien and Alina to her private chambers with an urgency that left no room for delay. "Is it true?" the old woman asked, her voice weaker than it had been at the wedding, though her eyes remained sharp and searching as she studied first her grandson, then Alina, waiting for either of them to falter. Damien knelt beside her chair, taking her frail hand in both of his own. "It began as an arrangement, grandmother. I will not lie to you about that. I came to Alina in desperation, believing I needed nothing more than the appearance of a wife to satisfy the terms of your will." Lady Beatrice's expression tightened, and Alina felt her stomach drop, certain that whatever fragile trust had been built over recent months was about to collapse entirely. "But it did not remain merely an arrangement," Damien continued, his voice growing steadier, more certain, as though speaking the truth aloud for the first time clarified something within himself as much as it clarified matters for his grandmother. "Somewhere between that first desperate bargain and today, I fell in love with my wife, grandmother. Genuinely, completely, in a way I never expected to feel again after Cassandra. Whatever the circumstances of our beginning, what exists between us now is entirely real." The old woman studied him for a long, silent moment, then turned her gaze to Alina, searching her face with the same careful scrutiny. "And you, child, do you feel the same, or have you simply grown accustomed to comfort and security you did not previously possess?" Alina met the old woman's eyes without flinching, understanding that this moment demanded complete honesty, regardless of the consequences it might bring. "I did not expect to feel anything beyond gratitude when I first agreed to this arrangement," she said. "I believed I was simply securing my son's future, nothing more. But I have come to love your grandson, Lady Beatrice, not for his title or his wealth, but for the man he has revealed himself to be beneath a reputation that never told the full truth about him." Lady Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hand still resting within Damien's grasp. Finally, something softened in her expression, a smile touching the corners of her mouth despite the gravity of the situation. "Then let whoever spread this rumor discover the truth for themselves," she said. "A love that grows from honest beginnings, however unconventional, is worth defending far more fiercely than any arrangement built solely on title and convenience. Damien, you will address this publicly, and you will do so without hesitation. Let no one doubt the strength of what you have built with this woman." That evening, Damien arranged for a gathering at Ashworth Manor, inviting every family who had received the anonymous letter, along with several respected figures whose good opinion mattered greatly within the city's social circles. Alina stood beside him as he addressed the assembled guests directly, his voice carrying none of the coldness his reputation had long suggested, but instead a quiet, unwavering conviction that silenced even the most skeptical whispers in the room. "Someone has taken it upon themselves to question the legitimacy of my marriage," he said, his eyes moving deliberately across the gathered faces. "I will not dignify the cowardice of an anonymous accusation with excessive explanation. I will simply say this. My wife and I began our union under circumstances that were, admittedly, born of necessity rather than romance. But necessity has given way to something far stronger, and I will not permit anyone within this city to suggest that what exists between us now is anything less than genuine. Anyone who wishes to challenge that truth may do so to my face, rather than hiding behind anonymous letters delivered under cover of darkness." The room remained silent for a long moment before Lord Whitmore, standing near the back of the gathering, began to applaud, slowly at first, then joined by others until the room filled with the sound of approval rather than suspicion. Alina felt tears gather in her eyes, overwhelmed by the fierce loyalty Damien had shown her before an audience capable of destroying both their reputations with nothing more than continued gossip. Reginald, who had attended the gathering with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality, approached them once the crowd began to disperse, his smile as smooth and unreadable as ever. "A moving speech, cousin," he said. Though I wonder who might have started such a vicious rumor in the first place. Someone with clear motive to see your marriage dissolved before it could be considered legitimate, perhaps. I wonder the same thing, Damien replied evenly, his eyes fixed on his cousin with an intensity that left no doubt as to his suspicions. Rest assured, Reginald, I intend to discover exactly who is responsible, and I intend to ensure they face the full consequences of their actions. Reginald's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, gone before Alina could be entirely certain she had seen it at all. I do hope you succeed, he said smoothly, before excusing himself to rejoin the remaining guests. Alina watched him walk away, a cold certainty settling in her chest despite the warmth of Damien's public declaration only moments before. He will not stop with a rumor, she said quietly, once Reginald was out of earshot. Tonight has only made him more desperate. I know, Damien said, his jaw tight, which is precisely why we must move more carefully than ever before. His prediction proved accurate within the week. A new accusation began circulating, far more dangerous than the first, claiming that fresh evidence had emerged suggesting Damien's involvement in the death of his first wife, evidence supposedly discovered by a concerned party wishing to protect the public from a man capable of such terrible deception. The evidence, when Damien finally obtained a copy through a contact within the magistrate's office, consisted of a forged letter supposedly written by Cassandra shortly before her death, expressing fear of her husband and suspicion regarding his intentions toward her. This is fabricated, Damien said, his hands trembling with barely controlled fury as he examined the document in his study, Alina standing close beside him. Cassandra never wrote in this hand. Look at the formation of the letters here, compared to genuine correspondence I have retained from our marriage. Alina studied the documents Damien retrieved from a locked drawer, comparing the handwriting carefully. The differences were subtle but unmistakable once pointed out. A slightly different slant, a different pressure applied to certain letters, details that might escape a casual observer but which betrayed the forgery to anyone examining the documents side by side with genuine samples. We must bring this to the magistrate immediately, Alina said. Show him the discrepancy, prove the letter is false. It will not be so simple, Damien said grimly. The magistrate who originally investigated Cassandra's death was a close associate of my father, appointed through family connection rather than merit. He has since retired, replaced by a younger man eager to prove his impartiality, which unfortunately means he may be more inclined to pursue this new evidence aggressively rather than dismiss it quickly, regardless of my protests. Within days, Damien received formal notice requesting his presence before the magistrate to answer questions regarding the new evidence surrounding Cassandra's death. Public opinion, so recently swayed in his favor by his passionate defense of his marriage to Alina, began shifting once more, whispers of murder replacing whispers of deception, old rumors resurfacing with renewed vigor now that fresh evidence, however fabricated, had given them new life. They will use this to destroy everything, Damien said one evening, packing the length of his study while Alina watched from a nearby chair, Oliver already asleep upstairs under careful guard. If the magistrate rules against me, even without solid proof, the damage to my reputation may prove permanent. Reginald would finally achieve what he has wanted all along, not through inheritance law, but through scandal severe enough to force me from society entirely, perhaps even from the estate itself, should the accusations somehow result in formal charges. Then we must prove the letter is false, and we must prove who truly forged it, Alina said, rising from her chair with sudden determination. You said yourself the handwriting differs from genuine samples. Surely a document expert could confirm this discrepancy formally, providing evidence the magistrate cannot simply dismiss. Perhaps, Damien said, though doubt lingered in his voice. But proving the letter is forged does not prove who forged it. Without identifying the true culprit, suspicion will simply shift from one theory to another, never fully resolving, leaving this shadow hanging over us indefinitely. Elena thought carefully, turning the problem over in her mind as she had once turned over difficult questions regarding her small shop's finances, searching for practical solutions rather than succumbing to despair. "Then we find proof of who commissioned the forgery," she said finally. "A forger skilled enough to nearly deceive even you would not work without payment, and payment leaves traces, particularly for a man like Reginald, who has spent recent months meeting quietly with men of questionable reputation in the city, exactly as your own investigations have already suggested." Damien's expression sharpened with renewed purpose, the despair that had begun creeping into his features replaced by something more determined. "You believe we might trace payment records, or find someone willing to testify against him?" "I believe desperate men make mistakes," Elena said. "Reginald has grown careless in his desperation, first with the garden wall, now with this forged letter. If we search carefully enough, we may find the thread that unravels his entire scheme." Together, they began working quietly, discreetly, gathering what information they could without alerting Reginald to their efforts. Damien's most trusted servant, a footman named Peter who had served the family since childhood, agreed to quietly observe Reginald's movements, noting his visits to the city, the men he met with, any unusual correspondence that might provide the evidence they needed. Elena, meanwhile, began reviewing the household's financial records more carefully than ever before, searching for any unusual transactions that might connect Reginald to the forger's payment, or reveal expenses that could not be easily explained through legitimate means. Their efforts, though careful, did not go entirely unnoticed. Reginald, sensing perhaps that his schemes were finally at risk of exposure, began taking greater precautions himself, meeting his associates in increasingly remote locations, destroying correspondence rather than retaining it, growing more cautious and more dangerous in equal measure as the walls he had built around his true intentions began, slowly but surely, to show their first genuine cracks. The magistrate's hearing loomed closer with each passing day, and Elena found herself lying awake at night beside Damien, both of them tense with the knowledge that everything they had built together, their marriage, their family, their fragile happiness discovered amid such unlikely circumstances, now hung entirely in the balance, dependent on whether they could uncover the truth before Reginald's carefully constructed lies destroyed it all beyond any hope of repair. Peter returned to the manor 3 nights before the scheduled hearing, his face pale with the weight of what he had discovered, requesting an immediate audience with Damien and Elena in the privacy of the study. He had followed Reginald to a tavern on the far edge of the city, a place known for its discretion regarding matters its patrons preferred to keep hidden, and had watched through a rain-streaked window as Reginald met with a thin, nervous man whose hands, Peter noted, were permanently stained with ink. "I could not hear their full conversation," Peter admitted, "but I recognized the man from a previous errand I once ran for the family years ago. He worked for a time copying legal documents for the estate before he was dismissed for altering figures in his own favor. I believe he is the same man capable of forging Lady Cassandra's handwriting." "A name," Damien said urgently. "Do you know his name?" "Harold Pratt, your grace. He kept lodgings near the docks the last I knew of him, though whether he remains there now I cannot say for certain." Damien wasted no time. Within the hour, he had dispatched a trusted associate, a former soldier who now handled delicate matters requiring both discretion and firmness, to locate Harold Pratt and bring him quietly to the manor before Reginald could learn that his forger had been discovered. Elena spent those anxious hours packing the length of the drawing room, praying they would find the man before Reginald realized the danger closing in around him. Harold Pratt arrived at Ashworth Manor shortly after midnight, escorted firmly but without harm by the soldier Damien had sent, his thin face pale and sweating despite the cool night air. He initially denied any knowledge of the forged letter, insisting he had never heard the name Reginald Ashworth. But his composure crumbled quickly once Damien produced both the forged letter and genuine samples of Cassandra's handwriting side by side, along with a ledger Alina had discovered earlier that week, buried among the estate's older financial records, documenting an unusual payment made 3 years prior for what had been vaguely described as consulting services. A payment that matched almost exactly the sum Harold Pratt would likely have demanded for such delicate work. He said it would ruin no one, Harold stammered finally, his resolve breaking under the combined weight of evidence and Damien's unwavering gaze. He said the letter would only be used to encourage suspicion, nothing more, that it would never truly be presented as evidence unless matters became desperate. He paid me handsomely, Your Grace, and threatened worse should I ever speak of the arrangement. I did not know he intended to use it to accuse you of murder before a magistrate. I swear I did not know it would go so far. You will repeat everything you have just told me before the magistrate, Damien said, his voice cold and final. And in exchange, I will ensure the courts show leniency regarding your own role in this deception, given your cooperation now. Harold agreed readily, clearly relieved to unburden himself of a secret that had evidently weighed on him considerably since Reginald's most recent, more serious request. With his testimony secured, along with the handwriting samples and the ledger documenting the original payment, Damien and Alina finally possessed everything necessary to expose the truth before the magistrate could rule on accusations built entirely upon a foundation of lies. The hearing, when it finally arrived, drew a crowd far larger than the magistrate's chambers could comfortably hold, spectators spilling into the hallway outside, eager to witness whether the feared Duke of Ashworth would finally face justice for a crime whispered about for years, or whether he would somehow escape consequence as many believed he had after his first wife's mysterious death. Reginald sat near the front of the gathering, his expression composed into an appropriate mask of solemn concern, though Alina noticed his eyes darting occasionally toward the door, as though some part of him anticipated trouble he could not quite name. When the magistrate called for evidence supporting the newly surfaced accusations, Damien rose calmly, presenting the forged letter alongside genuine samples of Cassandra's handwriting, inviting the magistrate and assembled witnesses to examine the clear discrepancies themselves. A document expert, retained specifically for this hearing, confirmed formally what Alina had first noticed weeks earlier, that the letter had indeed been forged, the handwriting deliberately imitated but ultimately betraying subtle inconsistencies that no genuine document would contain. A murmur swept through the crowded chamber, and Alina watched Reginald's composure begin, finally, to crack, a thin sheen of sweat appearing along his brow, despite the cool air of the chamber. Then Damien called Harold Pratt to testify. The forger's account, delivered in a shaking but clear voice, described in careful detail his meeting with Reginald Ashworth, the payment he received, the explicit instructions to forge Cassandra's handwriting to suggest fear and suspicion toward her husband, all of it corroborated by the ledger entry Alina had discovered, documenting a payment made under vague pretenses that matched precisely the timeline of the letter's creation. Reginald rose from his seat before the magistrate could even call for a response, his composure finally shattering entirely. "This man is lying," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation that betrayed guilt more clearly than any calm denial could have achieved. He was dismissed from this family's employment years ago, and clearly bears some grudge he wishes to satisfy through false testimony. "And the ledger entry, Reginald?" Damien asked evenly, holding up the document for the entire chamber to see. "Written in your own hand, authorizing payment for services never fully explained. Perhaps you would care to clarify what consulting services you required from a man dismissed for forgery, paid the exact week before a letter surfaced supposedly written by my late wife." Reginald had no answer, his mouth opening and closing without producing any coherent defense, the assembled crowd watching his composure crumble entirely under the weight of evidence he could no longer refute. The magistrate, observing the proceedings with careful attention, called for a brief recess to review the evidence formally. Though the outcome, given the overwhelming nature of what had been presented, seemed already a foregone conclusion to everyone present in the chamber. When proceedings resumed, the magistrate delivered his ruling with clear, measured words. The original accusations against Damien regarding his first wife's death were dismissed entirely, the evidence proving conclusively that the letter supporting them had been fabricated. Reginald Ashworth, meanwhile, would face formal charges of forgery and deliberate deception, intended to defraud his own family, charges serious enough to ensure he would never again pose a threat to Damien, Elena, or Oliver's safety and inheritance. As guards moved to escort Reginald from the chamber, he turned back once more toward Damien, his expression twisted with bitter resentment. "This inheritance should have been mine," he spat. "I spent years watching you inherit everything simply through accident of birth, while I received nothing despite equal blood and far greater ambition." "Ambition without honor is simply greed wearing a finer coat," Damien replied evenly. "You had every opportunity to build something of your own, Reginald. Instead, you chose to destroy what belonged to others rather than create anything of value yourself. That choice and its consequences belong entirely to you." Reginald said nothing further, allowing himself to be led away in silence. His schemes finally and completely unraveled before the very society he had hoped to use against his cousin. Thank you for watching and comment for next part.